Somewhere around the 10th century, Chinese performers were already jumping from towers using rigid, umbrella-like frames, not because they had anywhere useful to go, but because the crowd found it spectacular. The devices were not parachutes in any modern sense. They were closer to oversized parasols, built from bamboo and fabric, held open by their own structure rather than by air pressure, and they worked well enough that the performers survived. The record of exactly how well they worked is incomplete, but the practice continued long enough to be documented, which suggests the mortality rate was at least acceptable. The legendary account that predates even those performances involves an emperor. Shun, a figure from Chinese antiquity, was said to have escaped a grain storage structure set on fire by his father by jumping from the top holding two bamboo hats, one in each hand, using them as a paired drag surface to slow his fall enough to survive. Whether Shun was a historical person or a constructed figure used to teach principles of rulership is a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement. But the story itself is significant because it describes someone solving the problem of controlled descent, using nothing more than two objects that happen to catch air. The engineering intuition behind it, that surface area slows a falling body, is the same intuition that eventually produced every parachute ever built. Leonardo da Vinci drew a workable version of the concept in 1495. His sketch showed a pyramidal canopy, roughly spherical in cross-section, with a wooden frame holding the shape open, and a person suspended below it by lines. He never built it and never tested it, but the proportions he drew were close enough to functional that a modern reconstruction using his exact specifications flew successfully. Da Vinci was not thinking about jumping from aircraft. He had no aircraft to think about. He was working through a mechanical problem that interested him, which was how to arrest the speed of a human body falling through air without killing the human body in the process. Fausto Veranzio, a Croatian polymath working a century after Da Vinci, studied the sketch and produced his own interpretation, a design he called Homo Volans, or the Flying Man, featuring a square canopy with a fabric panel stretched across a rigid frame and a person suspended below on four lines. Veranzio survived the test in 1617, which meant that by the time anyone thought seriously about powered flight, the problem of falling safely from it had already been partially solved. On the 22nd of October 1797, André-Jacques Garnerin climbed into a wicker basket suspended beneath a hot air balloon above Paris, with a 23-foot silk canopy folded like a closed umbrella over his head, and no particular guarantee that any of it would work. He had been working on the design for several years, testing ideas that drew from the basic principles Leonardo and Veranzio had sketched out but had never actually verified at altitude from a moving platform. The canopy was built around rigid ribs, holding a silk envelope in the folded position, the whole structure attached by lines to the basket below, and the basket itself connected to the balloon by a single tether he planned to cut on the way up. He released it roughly 3,000 feet above Parc Monceau. The canopy opened, he descended, and then the oscillation started. Without a vent at the apex of the canopy, air spilled unevenly from the edges as the parachute swung back and forth beneath the silk dome, and Garnerin arrived on the ground having survived the first documented parachute jump in history and having been violently seasick for most of it. The basket was swinging in arcs wide enough that witnesses on the ground reportedly found the descent alarming to watch. He landed hard but intact. The design worked in the essential sense. It arrested the fall and delivered him alive. But the ride down was unstable in a way that clearly needed solving. The fix proposed by the French astronomer Jérôme Lalande was a vent cut into the top of the canopy, a small opening that allowed air to escape evenly from the center rather than spilling chaotically from the perimeter. Garnerin incorporated the modification into subsequent versions of the design, and the oscillation problem was substantially reduced. That vent, in one form or another, appeared in round parachute designs for the next century and a half. What Garnerin had done on that October afternoon was move the entire enterprise from the category of reasonable theory into the category of demonstrated fact. Veranzio had jumped from a building in Venice in 1617 and survived. Garnerin had jumped from altitude, from a balloon, over a city, with a canopy that had to deploy from a folded state and arrest a fall fast enough to matter, and he had walked away from it. The gap between those two events was 180 years, and the gap between Garnerin's jump and everything that followed it in parachute history was considerably shorter. The basic architecture of his canopy, a fabric surface trapping air above a suspended load, remained the standard for parachute design well into the 20th century. A few years after that, his wife Jean Genevieve made the same jump from the same altitude, which established early that the equipment worked regardless of who was inside the basket. The balloon had one serious limitation that the airplane solved immediately. You could only use it once per day, you couldn't reliably aim it, and getting it to the right altitude over the right piece of ground required conditions the weather rarely provided on schedule. By 1911, the Wright brothers had been flying for 8 years. and a small number of people had started thinking about what a powered aircraft could do for parachuting that a balloon never could. An airplane could reach altitude in minutes, fly back to the same field, and go up again the same afternoon. It could be aimed. It could carry a jumper to a specific point over a specific piece of ground with a reliability that balloon flight could not approach. The platform was faster, more repeatable, and fundamentally more controllable than anything Garnerin had worked with above Paris. Grant Morton is credited with the first parachute jump from a powered aircraft, stepping off a Wright Model B over Venice Beach, California, sometime in 1911. The details of that jump are not precisely documented, and Morton did not leave behind the kind of paper trail that would settle the record permanently. He reportedly held the parachute in his arms on exit rather than wearing it in any conventional sense, and the canopy deployed as the wind caught it on the way out. It worked, which is the relevant fact. Albert Berry jumped from a Benoist pusher biplane over Kinloch Field in Missouri on the 1st of March 1912, and his jump is more thoroughly documented than Morton's. Berry descended from roughly 1,500 feet and landed near the airfield, making his attempt the one more historians point to when the argument comes up. The debate over which jump counts as the first has never been fully resolved, partly because defining what qualifies as a proper parachute jump from an aircraft depends on criteria that nobody had agreed on in 1911. What both jumps demonstrated, regardless of which one gets credit, was that an airplane could serve as a parachute platform in a way that changed the practical possibilities entirely. A balloon ascent required planning days in advance and delivered uncertain results. An airplane could make the same drop repeatable enough to build on. The speed of the aircraft also changed the aerodynamics of the exit, which would eventually matter a great deal to the people trying to design better equipment around what the jumper actually experienced on the way out. Both jumps used static lines, meaning the parachute opened the moment the jumper left the aircraft, which was survivable, but left the person falling with no say in what happened next. On the 28th of April 1919, Leslie Irvin stepped out of an airplane and did not immediately pull anything. That single decision separated everything that came before it from everything that followed. Every parachute jump since Garnerin in 1797 had operated on the same basic principle. The canopy opened the moment the jumper left the aircraft, either by static line or by the jumper pulling immediately on exit, and the fall was controlled by the equipment from the first second. Irvin changed that relationship entirely. He fell first. He pulled second. The sequence sounds trivial written down, but what it represented was the first time a human being had deliberate authority over the descent rather than the parachute having it for them. He was not surviving a fall. He was choosing when to end one. Irvin was a Hollywood stuntman and aviator who had spent years around aircraft and parachutes before he designed the manually activated ripcord that made the jump possible. The device was straightforward in concept. A D-ring attached to the jumper's harness, connected by cable to the parachute pack, which the jumper pulled at a moment of their own choosing rather than having the canopy yanked open by a line fixed to the aircraft. What it required in practice was a jumper willing to exit the aircraft and remain in freefall long enough to confirm the concept worked. Irvin was that person. He exited the aircraft over McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, fell in freefall, and pulled the ripcord himself. He broke his ankle on landing. The parachute worked exactly as intended. 2 months later, in June 1919, Irvin founded Irvin Airchutes, the first company in the world built specifically around parachute manufacturing. The manual ripcord became the company's central product, and the military procurement that followed gave the organization the scale to develop equipment well beyond what a single inventor working alone could have managed. By the time the Second World War created demand for parachutes in quantities nobody in 1919 had imagined, Irvin Airchutes had the manufacturing infrastructure and the institutional knowledge to meet it. The shift from static line deployment to manual activation also did something less visible but equally significant. It made the person falling into an active participant rather than a passenger. In that concept, the jumper as the agent of their own descent is the conceptual foundation on which competitive and recreational skydiving was eventually built. The company has founded that same year, Irvin Airchutes, eventually produced the first nylon parachute during the Second World War, which meant the material that most people associate with the modern sport came from a manufacturer that existed because one person wanted to find out what freefall actually felt like. Italian assault troops made the first operational military parachute jump in August 1918, which established that parachutes were not just emergency equipment, but could be used deliberately to put soldiers somewhere they were not expected. The concept did not immediately transform warfare. The war ended 3 months later, and the armies that might have developed the idea further demobilized before anyone had time to build a doctrine around it. But the proof of concept survived the armistice, and the military planners who had watched it understood that what had worked once over an Italian battlefield could be scaled. The scaling took 2 decades. Through the 1930s, the Soviet Union developed the first large airborne units, training thousands of soldiers in mass parachute drops and demonstrating the concept at military exercises attended by foreign observers, including German officers who returned home and built their own program. The German Fallschirmjäger were operational by 1939 and conducted the invasion of Crete in May 1941, using airborne assault as the primary method of attack, the largest purely airborne operation in history at that point. The United States watched all of this and began organizing its own airborne divisions in 1940, a program that expanded with considerable speed once the country entered the war in December 1941. By 1944, the American airborne establishment included the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, each fielding roughly 14,000 soldiers trained and equipped to jump from aircraft into combat. The drops on the night of the 5th and 6th of June 1944, preceding the Normandy landings, put approximately 13,000 American paratroopers over the Cotentin Peninsula in a matter of hours. Operation Market Garden in September of the same year dropped more than 20,000 Allied paratroopers into the Netherlands over 3 days, the largest airborne operation ever conducted. Supporting all of this required a manufacturing base, operating at a scale that the pre-war parachute industry could not have imagined. The United States produced more than 35 million parachutes during the war years, for paratroopers, cargo drop, emergency bailouts, and equipment recovery. The workforce that manufactured them, the riggers who packed them, and the instructors who trained jumpers on them represented an industrial and human infrastructure that had not existed in 1939. The equipment improved in direct response to combat experience. Harness designs were strengthened after early jumps produced injuries from opening shock. Static line systems were refined to reduce malfunctions at low altitude. Reserve parachutes were standardized across services. Each failure in the field produced a technical response, and by 1945, the parachute that a soldier wore into a combat jump was meaningfully better than the one his predecessors had used 4 years earlier. When the war ended, the United States alone had trained enough paratroopers to fill several small countries, and a significant number of them had no interest in returning to a life where jumping out of aircraft was not part of the arrangement. In 1946, the organization that would eventually become the United States Parachute Association formed in New York, with around 100 members, most of them veterans. No particular plan beyond the shared conviction that jumping out of aircraft was worth doing when nobody was shooting at you. What that organization represented, even at 100 members, was something the sport had never had before. Military parachuting had been driven entirely by institutional necessity, with equipment developed by governments, training standardized by armies. The decision of when and whether to jump made by someone with a rank higher than yours. The veterans who formed the USPA were making a different argument, that the act itself had value outside of combat, that an organization built around that argument was worth the effort of sustaining. The word skydiving didn't exist yet. Through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, participants still called what they did parachuting, a word that described the equipment more than the experience. It was Raymond Young, in the mid-1950s, who first used the term skydiver to describe the people around him in the sport. The word spread because it described something the old terminology missed, the deliberate, chosen quality of the fall itself, the part that happened before the canopy opened. Lou Sanborn and Jacques-André Istel opened the first non-military parachuting school in Orange, Massachusetts in 1959. That address, a commercial drop zone where anyone without a military background could pay to learn the skill, was the point at which the sport stopped being a veterans club and started being an institution. Istel in particular had been pushing for exactly this kind of formal civilian infrastructure for years. The school in Orange reflected a belief that skydiving could be taught systematically to people who had never worn a uniform. The USPA, which had started as a gathering of former paratroopers with a shared interest, now had something closer to a mission. International competition had been developing separately. The first World Parachuting Championships had been held in Yugoslavia in 1951, with accuracy landing as the primary discipline. The events that followed established a framework for standardized judging and international participation that the sport had not previously needed. When the United States hosted its own World Parachuting Championships in 1962, the USPA was no longer an informal association of veterans keeping a wartime skill alive in peacetime. It had a membership that extended well beyond combat experience, a training infrastructure with commercial drop zones, a place in an international competitive calendar. By the time the first World Parachuting Championships were held on American soil in 1962, the activity had accumulated enough institutional structure, governing bodies, training schools, international competition, that calling it a hobby had started to feel inadequate. Until the 1960s, Every parachute in serious use worked on essentially the same principle Garnerin had applied in 1797. Trap air in a dome, slow the fall, and accept that you were going to land wherever the wind decided. Round canopies were drag devices. They created resistance against the air beneath them, and that resistance slowed the descent. But they offered almost no meaningful control over direction. A jumper could pull on suspension lines to tilt the dome slightly and induce a slow rotation, but the ground you landed on was largely a function of wind speed, wind direction, and whatever you could negotiate with the toggles in the final seconds before impact. For military purposes and emergency bailouts, that was acceptable. For a sport trying to develop precision landing, formation, and pinging competitive disciplines, it was a fundamental ceiling on what the activity could ever become. In 1962, Domina Jalbert, a kite and balloon designer based in Florida, developed the first ram air parachute, working alongside Paul Poppenhager. What Jalbert designed was not a dome at all. It was a rectangular wing built from 2 layers of fabric connected by internal cells running from the front edge to the rear, open at the leading edge so that forward air pressure inflated each cell as the canopy moved through the air. The structure that resulted was not trapping air underneath it to create drag. It was generating lift across its upper surface, the same way an aircraft wing does, which meant it was flying rather than falling. A ram air canopy under a skydiver at full inflation was aerodynamically a wing with the jumper hanging below it on risers and steering lines running to the trail. Engage on each side, pull the right toggle, and the right side of the canopy deflected, turning the wing. Pull both, and the canopy flared, dramatically reducing forward speed in the final seconds before touchdown. Landing accuracy went from a matter of luck to a matter of skill. The practical differences this produced were not incremental. A jumper under a round canopy was a passenger. A jumper under a ram air canopy was a pilot. Descent rates dropped. Forward speed in the range of 20 to 30 miles per hour gave the canopy enough energy to flare into a near-standing landing on a specific target. Skydivers who had spent years accepting that the wind owned the last 1,000 feet of their jump suddenly had a tool that let them make decisions all the way to the ground. Through the 1970s, the skydiving community made the transition from round to rectangular canopies at a pace that reflected how significant the difference was. By the end of the decade, square parachutes had become the standard for civilian jumping, and round canopies had retreated almost entirely to millet-dunkel, airy static line applications, where the older design still served its original purpose. Group jumping followed directly from the new canopy's capabilities. When every person in a formation could steer to a specific landing area, rather than scatter across whatever the wind provided, organizing multi-person jumps became logistically feasible for the first time. Formation skydiving developed as a discipline around the idea that teams could build shapes in freefall and then separate cleanly before deploying canopies with enough control to land together. The first formation skydiving competition in the United States was held in New York in 1970, which would have been logistically impossible with round canopies. You cannot build a formation in freefall and then expect everyone to land in the same county. In 1982, Bill Booth solved a problem that had existed since the first reserve parachute was packed. If your main canopy malfunctions badly enough, cutting it away before deploying the reserve has to happen fast, under stress, with hands that may not be cooperating. The hardware he designed to solve it is deceptively simple. 3 metal rings, each one threaded through the next in a loop, connect the main parachute risers to the harness. The mechanical advantage that arrangement creates means a relatively small force on the release handle is sufficient to free the entire load, even with several hundred pounds of drag pulling against it. Before the 3-ring system, cutaway mechanisms required more strength and more deliberate manipulation than a panicked or partially incapacitated jumper could reliably produce. Booth's design is now standard on every skydiving rig manufactured anywhere in the world. That is a fairly clear statement about how thoroughly it solved the problem it was built for. Less than a year later, a separate failure mode was addressed from a completely different direction. On the 15th of January 1983, Ted Strong and Ricky Meadows completed the first jump using a purpose-built tandem skydiving harness, a system designed from the ground up to carry 2 people attached to a single set of parachutes, with an instructor in control throughout the entire descent. The practical implication was significant. Prior to that jump, anyone who wanted to experience freefall had to complete a training program before they were allowed to exit an aircraft without a static line. Tandem equipment made it possible for a person with no prior instruction to jump the same day they arrived at a drop zone. Secured to a rated instructor, who managed the deployment and the landing, Strong Enterprises received the first FAA exemption permitting tandem jumps as an instructional method in 1984. The dual hawk tandem system that followed gave the sport a way to introduce new participants that no earlier training method had provided. The numbers reflect what that access meant. The population of people who had experienced freefall grew faster after tandem instruction became available than it had during all the preceding decades of civilian skydiving combined. Both of those developments, the three-ring cutaway system and tandem equipment, addressed problems a jumper could at least partially manage if they remained conscious and functional. The third piece arrived in 1989 and covered the case where they could not. The automatic activation device monitors barometric altitude and vertical speed throughout a jump, and if it detects that a skydiver is still in freefall at an altitude and velocity consistent with an unopened parachute, it fires the reserve without any input from the person wearing it. The device cannot be argued with, cannot be forgotten in the excitement of exit, does not require the skydiver to do anything at all. The AAD that arrived in 1989 closed the last gap in that sequence. A skydiver incapacitated in freefall, whether from hypoxia, a collision, or plain unconsciousness, now had a device that would fire the reserve without waiting to be asked. Joseph Kittinger stepped out of an open gondola at 102,800 feet above New Mexico on the 16th of August 1960 and fell for 4 minutes and 36 seconds before pulling his ripcord, setting a record that would stand untouched for 52 years. At that altitude, the sky above is black and the curvature of the Earth is visible at the edges of the frame. Kittinger was a U.S. Air Force test pilot, and his jump was not a sporting event or a marketing exercise, but a military research program called Project Excelsior, designed to determine whether pilots could survive bailout from aircraft operating at extreme altitude. He wore a pressurized suit, ascended beneath a helium balloon, and stepped off a platform that was effectively the edge of the atmosphere. The data his body generated on the way down informed high-altitude ejection seat research for decades. Nothing serious challenged that record for more than half a century. Then, in 2012, an Austrian skydiver named Felix Baumgartner and an energy drink company decided to do something about it. The Red Bull Stratos mission launched on the 14th of October 2012 from Roswell, New Mexico, with Baumgartner sealed inside a pressurized capsule attached beneath a helium balloon roughly the size of a stadium. The ascent to 127,852 feet took approximately 2.5 hours. At that altitude, an unprotected human body would have blood that boils at normal body temperature, and the atmospheric pressure is so low that a standard skydiving suit provides no meaningful protection. Baumgartner wore a full-pressure suit developed specifically for the mission, functionally similar to what astronauts wear during NG launch and re-entry, and Kittinger himself, then 84 years old, served as capsule communicator from mission control on the ground. When Baumgartner stepped off the capsule's platform, he accelerated through the thin upper atmosphere, faster than any human in freefall before him. He reached 843.6 miles per hour, Mach 1.25, becoming the first person to break the sound barrier under no power other than gravity. The total freefall lasted 4 minutes and 19 seconds before he deployed his parachute at lower altitude and landed in the New Mexico desert. The entire event was broadcast live on YouTube and drew a peak concurrent audience of around 8 million viewers, making it the most watched live stream in history at the time. Red Bull's logo was on the capsule, the suit, the balloon envelope, and every frame of footage that went out to those 8 million screens simultaneously. Whether it belonged in the category of aerospace research or advertising was a question most people resolved by deciding it was both, and that neither answer diminished what Baumgartner had actually done at 127,852 feet. The pressurized suit, the capsule life support systems, and the balloon envelope were all genuine engineering problems solved specifically for this mission, none of them borrowed from existing technology without significant modification. Felix Baumgartner died in July 2025, and the jump he made over New Mexico 13 years earlier remains the most watched freefall in human history, simultaneously an exercise in aerospace research and the most expensive advertisement ever filmed. 2 years after Baumgartner's jump had been watched by 8 million people simultaneously, Alan Eustace went higher with almost nobody watching. Eustace was a retired senior vice president at Google, not a professional daredevil, and a project he had been quietly working on since 2011 with a small engineering team called ILC Dover had no corporate sponsor with a global marketing budget behind it. There was no live YouTube broadcast. There was no countdown watched by millions of people refreshing a stream. There was a helium balloon, a self-contained spacesuit, and a retired technology executive ascending alone over the New Mexico desert on the morning of the 24th of October 2014. The suit Eustace wore was itself a significant piece of engineering. Unlike Baumgartner, who jumped from a pressurized capsule and wore a suit developed with support from a large aerospace contractor, Eustace's team built a self-contained unit designed to keep a human being alive in conditions closer to the vacuum of space than to the atmosphere that sustains ordinary skydiving. The suit had to manage pressure, temperature, and oxygen independently, because at 135,889 feet, none of those things exist in any form the human body can use. His team developed several new technologies specifically for stratospheric exploration in the process of building it, none of which existed before the project required them. The freefall lasted 4 minutes and 27 seconds. Eustace reached 822 miles per hour, breaking the sound barrier in the process, and covered a total freefall distance of 123,414 feet before his canopy opened. The numbers were higher than Baumgartner's on every meaningful metric. The altitude was higher, the freefall distance was longer, and the record was set more quietly than almost any comparable achievement in the history of the sport. Baumgartner's mission had generated the kind of coverage normally reserved for space launches. Eustace's generated a wire story and a press release. On the 24th of October 2014, Eustace fell from 135,889 feet, broke the sound barrier, and landed in the New Mexico desert, and the current world record for the highest skydive has not moved since.